Well, I know you're all getting tired, so I've actually put in a few diagrams in here, and I hope I won't be too long. I'm just going to give a bit of a background. I think you all know all of this, so I'll skim through it. We're dealing with disputes all the time, and my mantra is do no harm. And as rep bodies, our role is to mitigate, mediate, minimise disputes. Disputes come from a whole variety of reasons. They might be generations old or recent. However, as you're well aware, and what we've already talked about today, there's all sorts of colonial impacts that have obviously contributed to disputes. So in particular, stolen generations, forced removals, and loss of access to land. On the right is a picture of the Northern Land Council's region, and the green areas are land trust land, so about 50% of the territory, the top end of the territory is land trust, which is under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, and all the purple area is where there's been a negotiated settlement or it's gone through to hearing and we've had a positive determination. And the orange and yellow areas, we're still in the process of research, and often some of these areas are quite contested and quite difficult. The other causes of contention: mixed descent, adoption, additional marriages. You're well aware that often adoptions are being contested quite regularly. Additional marriages, and what I mean is that in the early generations there might be someone who's married to a particular woman, for instance, and then that man may have married a second woman, and the family of the first woman doesn't recognise the family of the second woman. So there's all sorts of ways that genealogies are used and misused, perhaps, in disputes. Just as a bit of fun, this is actually a genealogy, you probably can't see it, of the British royal family. And the interesting thing to note is that you may or may not be aware that patrilineal descent is now changed in the legislation, so that, and I've forgotten her name, the second daughter of, the daughter of William is the second in line after, Charlotte is now second in line rather than being cut out by her younger brother. So even in such cases where this has been a long held practice, things change. In the same way that Kingsley hates the term sites, I hate boundaries. So one of my roles is to, and my apologies to the lawyers here, is to fight against lawyers asking us to put lines on maps. So the boundary issue is always that it's in Aboriginal tradition, it's rare to have a specific boundary unless you've got a significant geographical feature. And of course, the Tyndale, as you know, did a magnificent job of putting together a map of the whole of Australia, but there have been PhDs, books and lots of articles written about his inaccuracies. As you know, he used different sources. So I'm sure you're all aware of that. So in terms of boundaries, of course, the focus is on sites and not on the boundaries. So the traditional focus on sites, and I'm sorry, I shouldn't be using the term sites anymore, the traditional focus on dreaming tracts where a particular area is significant is what groups of people focus on, rather than a boundary between two groups, for instance. So what I really want to give you a couple of examples of is what I've termed urban and remote tensions. And I think you will understand what I mean by that, in that particularly in areas such as the Territory, where we have very remote areas and there is access is often difficult, particularly during the wet season, and people live there over the wet season. People who are connected to them, who are perhaps living in the larger towns, often don't visit very regularly. They're often highly educated compared to the people in the remote regions, and there's often a clear resentment from the people who are based remotely that they are living on country, they're protecting the country, they have the knowledge of country. Now, I'm not saying, of course, that urban people don't have the right to go to country, to have say of country, but that tension is very, very common and often is the cause of disputes. What I've termed back to the future is just really what we are trying to do is that enabling, and there was some discussion about repatriation. Now, again, I could talk for hours about repatriation. It's a very complex issue, but we are looking at repatriation, but it has to be done very carefully because we are not the experts in culture. Aboriginal people are, and we have to be very careful we are not undermining emerging leaders. At the same time, we hold an enormous archive, particularly in the Territory, of 50 years of documentation about Aboriginal people. And obviously before that, many anthropologists who worked in the area. And we have to be very careful the way we repatriate, the way we use that. But we are using that, and I'll give you a couple of recent examples. So, for instance, we had a long-standing dispute between subgroups of a language area, and what I did with one of our regional anthropologists and our genealogist is go to talk to these people, take back, it happened to be Kingsley Palmer's report, to say, well, this is what was given in evidence, this is the stories that came from your ancestors about this country, these were the groups that were identified. So what we've done is we've then focused more on the way people now see themselves with respect to that evidence 40 years ago. And what was happening was that when we started, there were 21 groups that were considered as part of this wider language grouping. We've taken those down to now 15 local groups, and before we couldn't hold a full consultation with all the different groups that are fighting. What we're going to do is talk to these groups separately and then gradually bring them together. One project that unfortunately we also were trying to do was, I need to tell you that we've done a project with Tony Bowman of bringing back her materials to the Land Council, and we had the intention of going out with Tony Bowman to an area where there were again some disputes, and the idea was we would take her photos, which she has now given to us to be used for the benefit of traditional owners. And what she did was she identified with current traditional owners any names that she didn't have knowledge of. What we intended to do is take back those photos to this area to say, these were all your parents, your grandparents, some cases your great-grandparents, all worked together here. This is what we understand is that they told us about this country. So photos, we thought, was a way of starting out with that quite difficult conversation. Sadly, we haven't done that yet, but I'm about to ring Tony Bowman to see if we can do it this year. The traditional decision-making process is another issue which we've taken on, and actually this was a wider project where you're probably aware of our term land interest reference, land interest registers, where we are required to identify who are the people who are associated with a particular area. What we're doing more and more is writing down much more specifically what are the traditional making processes. At the same time, the NLC council members and other senior traditional owners directed us to do some senior men's and women's meetings, and the idea of that was that we again go back to basics. So just to make sure you're awake, you notice on the left there is in the territories, certainly in the southern part of the top end, the terms in particular area, for example, Mungai, Jungai, Jaju, Abaju, are still used and are still used as identifying different responsibilities for land. So on the right-hand side, there's a representation of that, but there's something wrong with that. Can anyone tell me? Okay, I think we need drink and break soon, but basically there's no distinction between mother's father and father's mother in that diagram. So this diagram is still somewhat representative of the patrilineal bias in many places in the territory. And interestingly enough, 20 years ago, when I first started at the Land Council, or maybe it's more than 20 years ago, late 90s, the expectation was that everything would go cognatic. That has not happened. If anything, we're getting more and more people are saying, no, we are still patrilineal and we have these responsibilities. So this is the last slide. This is an example of one of these meetings where we are facilitating under traditional owner instructions discussion and recording detailed traditional decision-making process that will inform NLC's consultation with the group and identify senior decision-making, how seniority is inquired, identify authority, and a process by which agreements are resolved, and then responsibilities if this is within the system. And I note that, of course, in some areas in the territory this system does not apply, or it applies to different levels, and also identifying non-group members. For example, there might be a senior ritual expert who's not actually a member of the group. And then finally, endorsement of these traditional decision-making processes. So this is something that is evolving, that we've only just really gradually going through the process, and we have always been, and I give full credit to one of our senior anthropologists, Gay English, who's really ensured that this process is done properly, and she has facilitated the way the anthropology has supported these processes. Of course, we have used male anthropologists where there's a men's meeting, and we've used a number of senior, well, I think Frank was part of one of these meetings, and Gareth Lewis was a part of another, and one of our male anthros, Sean, was also part of these meetings. So, this, as I said, this is work in progress, but I'm hopeful that, and in fact it has been successful in diminishing and enabling an agreement to go forward, which previously wasn't possible because of the disputes. Okay.
Thanks, Wendy. And yes, I'm mindful that this is the last presentation of the day and I'm the only thing standing between you and a drink, so I will try and be quick. My slides are a bit text heavy, sorry. I'm glad that Wendy had some nice pictures in hers. I was going to make a joke about Trump and falling asleep in an important meeting, but I won't. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about a case study of something that we worked on at YMAC last year. Also just want to acknowledge country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging on the country that we're on now, and also extend that across Australia to all the First Nations people that we work with. Very quickly, for those who don't know YMAC or where it is, this is a snapshot of our rep body region, so Pilbara region and the Geraldton or the Yamaji region. Over 40 positive determinations in both those regions, and YMAC's been involved in the majority of those in some capacity. You know, there's about sort of anywhere between 20 and 30 years of kind of research and claim work that kind of sits in our archive, so it's a lot of material, as you can imagine, which does help when it comes to trying to deal with some of these areas that are now in between determinations, although sometimes it does not help. So very quick general background. So, I mean, I think as most people are in the same situation here as well, we're operating in a really interesting and dynamic context currently. We have some really established PBCs in our regions. We have the newer PBCs that are sort of finding their feet. We've got new claims on foot. We've got some unclaimed areas as well, and also some early stage compensation work. So the unclaimed areas and the new claims are situated in an environment that is, you know, in my view, really different from 10 or 15 years ago. So you've got those established PBCs that are surrounding unclaimed areas, and you've got a lot of knowledge holders and the traditional owners that we're dealing with are, you know, often really native title savvy, but sort of native title fatigued as well. People are a little bit over it and often don't want to engage in the process or want to engage in a particular way. So over the last few years, I think we've had to become sort of more dynamic and flexible in the way that we engage with people for a lot of these areas. And a lot of that is as there's all these external pressures, you know, that people are really time poor. There's lots going on in the heritage space. There's lots going on in the PBC business. And then, you know, you've got a lot of other stakeholders and stuff around as well. And, you know, from our perspective, there continues to be a focus on trying to facilitate research and, where possible, resolve some of those big issues before those claims are lodged. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the triple N area, as we called it. So it's an unclaimed area, the white area there between the Nyamul, Nyangamada and Nala determinations. So Nyamul to the south was determined in 2019, and YMAC represented that claim up until about 2016. Nala, which is the blue there, which is that area is about 2 hours from Port Hedland if you go kind of northeast. That was determined around 2007. There were a couple of claims there, and YMAC represented those claims to determination. And then Nyangamada in the green, the Part A there, that was also a YMAC represented claim, and that was determined in 2009. So you've got some, particularly with Nala and Nyangamada, some really kind of established PBCs that are working in that space, and also with Nyamul as well. So that's just a few more details there, the PBCs as well. And I think other thing to say about this particular area is that it's not much on the map, but there was a bit of a combination of pastoral leases, unallocated Crown land, a little bit of reserve, but also mining activity. And that's one of the things that kind of precipitated the research to kick back in sort of late 2020, and because there was a lot of stuff that was kind of happening in that space, and traditional owners were really worried about what was happening on the country, and also concerned that the wrong people might be going out for surveys. So the area between the three determinations was not previously included in any of the surrounding determined native title claims. It also wasn't subject to any other different previous native title claims. Part of the reason for that was that people couldn't agree on a boundary in that area, and there was actually limited research done at the time into that area. It's also pretty hard country, quite inaccessible, and so there was things that were done by in-house anthropologists kind of at the time in the early to kind of mid-2000s, primarily to address boundary issues around the lodged claims, but not really looking at that area specifically. And I think it was that sort of idea of, oh, look, we'll get this stuff done and then we'll go back and have a look at this sort of leftover area later. And then sort of, 20 years later, here we are looking at things now. So the research and engagement for the area kicked off again in kind of late 2020, and between early 2021 and April 2025 there are about 28 engagements. So when I say engagements, I mean trips to speak to sort of senior knowledge holders and have conversations, interviews, conversations with PBC boards, PBC reps about that area, and speaking to all three groups, members from all three groups, to try and sort of work through a process. There were also several intensive field trips as well out to country, and a few choppers involved, and so that was obviously a really big part of the process, trying to get people out on that country that was quite inaccessible. And speaking about sites, which I don't know if I'm allowed to say that word anymore, but there was also this idea of had been conversations, and I don't want to divulge too much, but there were conversations about particular sites in that country that people talked about as being boundary markers. And so one of the key things that we were trying to do as part of this process was find those sites to be able to, from there, sort of start talking about, okay, well, where might some of these boundaries be, and how do people feel about these areas and those sites. So that was definitely one of the things that was being done as part of those chopper trips as well. And Luke, who's sitting in the room, was heavily involved in that process, I know it was a lot of fun. So as productive as the interviews and those trips were, it became clear really early on that the only real way to have agreement about the boundaries in that area, that also not great word, was for key knowledge holders from all three groups to meet and discuss. So getting everyone together and having what we were sort of thinking of as like just a big sort of research workshop. Essentially, obviously there was a little bit of concern about what that might be and how that might look, and we had, some people kind of pushing back on that, just not really sure what that process would look like. And so we kind of had to go through a little bit of conversations with everyone to try to figure out, how we were going to do that. But it was definitely something that people on the ground were pushing as well. It wasn't just the researchers at YMAC saying, oh, hey, let's have a big meeting. People that we were engaging with were talking about everyone getting together and sitting down in a room and having a discussion about the country. So what we did is propose a semi-informal workshop process where you'd have nominated people from all three groups would attend, discuss the area and a way forward. The anthros would be in the room to help talk through some of the research, to present some of the research back as well, and talk through those things. And so really the idea was it was sort of like a research-led process. Of course, what started to make it really tricky is that we were not only engaging with sort of knowledge holders and following our usual kind of research methodology, but we were having to engage with all three of the surrounding PBCs and their legal representatives as well. So that's where it became tricky, where you've got some different views, and no disrespect to the legal colleagues in the room, but there were some very different views about how to do this and what the process was from an anthropological versus a legal perspective. And even more interesting is that we're talking about an unclaimed area, right? So the PBCs and those legal reps have no jurisdiction in that area. But of course, they're representing people from a determined area that's neighbouring, where those people do have interest, or they might have an interest in that area. So it became really tricky to tease some of things out, and who, had the authority to speak for various things, and who was responsible for making decisions around these sorts of things. So pretty complex. So it got to the point where it was pretty clear we would need someone external to facilitate the workshop, and so YMAC contacted the tribunal to see how they could assist, and it was sort of agreed between everyone who came to the table that we'd start with one workshop and go from there. We ended up having three. We didn't really know what those workshops were going to look like at the beginning, but they did kind of develop in real time. It took about 2 years to get there in terms of when we started really pushing this idea of having a research workshop, but then once it started, it all kind of happened quite quickly. So we had the first one in May of last year, then in August, and then in October, and then actually some outcomes have happened since then, which I'll talk about in a bit. But as you can imagine, it was really logistically challenging. We have 3 different groups of people. The meeting needed to be in the Pilbara. We had, staff and legal reps in Perth and Broome, common law, all knowledge holders in various places across the Pilbara. The tribunal member was in Queensland. So it was finding a date and a time time took a fair bit of coordination, but also as well having the scope and the intentions of the workshop clear and agreed. And that's what took some time, is that tension between how, the anthropologists, the researchers saw it going, and how, the legal reps of the PBCs saw it going and what they thought it was about. There was always this reference to it being, it's a negotiation meeting. It's like, it's not a negotiation meeting. It's a meeting for people to come together and talk about country. We're not negotiating an agreement or anything like that here. It was really a first stage to see what we could do to sort of try to resolve this area. So how did it work? So we contacted the tribunal for assistance. There were a few meetings between the tribunal member and myself and some other research staff, a bit of background information, and then we engaged them through the dispute resolutions as well. So once that kind of engagement was there, it meant the rep body, YMAC in its native title rep body capacity, engaged the tribunal to help with this matter. There was then a Teams meeting with all reps from all the three groups, and that was that conversation where we were really trying to discuss the purpose, the scope, the legalities, the confidentiality, whatever information was discussed in the meeting, like where would that go, who's privy to that, and how's it going to be used later on. So there were some really robust discussions, as you can imagine, but what was really great was the fact that once we had the tribunal engaged, that sort of coordination process and the setting of the agenda and the reaching out to the different parties was actually done by the member. So that just meant that from YMAC's perspective, myself and others could kind of take a step back and really focus on what our job needed to be rather than try to coordinate all these things. And, to be honest, with some of the legal reps, they just weren't really engaging with us as researchers as part of this process. So it did really help to have, the tribunal member kind of dealing with this. So as I just said, while we coordinated the meeting and had research reps and regional staff on the day, the tribunal member really coordinated things. And by the time we got to that first workshop in May, we did have a pretty clear agenda and an agreement of how things were going to work and the fact that the member would facilitate the meeting. So there was lots of buy-in from the legal reps and PBCs and ideas around how the day should run. But really, again, from our perspective, we wanted to make sure that the knowledge holders or the traditional owners were really leading the process. It was about what they wanted to talk about, who they wanted to nominate to attend, and where the information would go, how it would be used at the end of the process. So that knowledge holder-led aspect was built into the agenda and the purpose of the workshop, and it was supported by the tribunal in their facilitation. There were a variety of participants invited to the first workshop as nominated through the PBC and legal reps, and at the end of the first workshop we had a working group nominated by the people there and agreed on, and that ended up involving senior men from all three groups, and they were the attendees invited to the subsequent two meetings. So across all three of the workshops, there were times when legal reps and or research staff and others were asked to leave the room. So there were some really focused conversations by the knowledge holders, but the member was there to sort of say to assist and keep a bit of a record of what was happening. At the end of each workshop, we had like a bit of an outcomes sort of document sort of prepared, recapped everything, and then that document was sent to all the parties to approve and kind of be agreed, okay, well, this is what we talked about, this is what was agreed or not agreed, and, this is the idea for the next workshop. So in terms of outcome, look, I believe the knowledge holder-led aspect of the workshop and then the subsequent two workshops was really key in the success of the process. And, people having those conversations about, agreement or acknowledgement of areas of country to claim, which was, the outcome of the third workshop, that conversation had to happen with the knowledge holders. And so it was very important that did occur. And not only was there a recorded and agreed outcome from all three workshops and the sharing of knowledge amongst attendees sort of at the meeting, but there was a really successful field trip which occurred after the second workshop, which actually really assisted in the agreement of a boundary for two of the groups. And so that was a really productive and I understand a really positive field trip after the workshop. So, and again, I don't want to go into too much detail, but it's kind of all publicly available now. So to date, we've had two of the three groups who have authorised a new claim each in the area, no overlap. The third group has notified for their meeting later this month. As they've advertised, I'm just trying to think about how to word this properly. They've advertised their meeting in their area, and one of the areas that they're looking to authorise does have an overlap over to one of the other areas, but this was discussed. So all of this was actually discussed at the workshop. And so there was that transparency, and I think, whilst there may be a small overlap as part of this area to deal with, it's not going to be a shock to anyone. There has been that conversation, and there's a body of work and research that's been done that will help that to be mediated, whether it's mediated in federal court or whatever happens, to go through that process. So compared to the alternative of what could have happened with this area, where you could have had 3 overlapping claims, you could have had all this sort of stuff happen, I think it really was a really good outcome. So some of the learnings from it, look, communicating early and frequently about the purpose of the workshops and the role of YMAC researchers playing, it was really vital. There was confusion. There was certainly pushback from some of the legal reps about, well, what is YMAC doing and in what capacity are you doing this work in? And so I think, if we do this process again or something similar, just being really clear from the very beginning about that and just making sure that that's understood by everyone. That anthros and lawyers think differently. I think we all probably knew that. But look, that was a source of tension where we had to really navigate through what we thought the purpose and the process of the workshops would be and what some of the legal reps thought was going to be happening at those workshops. Having our regional manager there, who also had connections to the area, was really invaluable. He did help to facilitate some of the men's conversations, and also, the tribunal facilitation and coordination of the meeting, the agenda, the outcomes documents, all of that. That just meant that we could kind of take a step back and really focus on the job of being researchers, being anthropologists. And having that external facilitation, also helped with perceptions of bias. So obviously we all consider ourselves, objective and independent researchers, but when you're working for a rep body, there's a history of things, and there are some people that have particular ideas about that. So this really did help with that perception of bias for some of the people who weren't sure about engaging in the first place. And having a process with outcomes meant that there was a clear agreement or not on the outcomes and next steps after each workshop as well. Thanks, everyone. Happy to talk about the process more offline as well, because I know we're pretty short on time. Thanks.